In a previous video, we discussed in detail what went wrong for the US military during the Iraq War. One intriguing aspect of America is its transparency. Even military analyses, which are considered state secrets in many countries, are often made public. Nearly 20 years after the war, the US military continues to produce and publish analyses related to the conflict. Here is a summary of some of those publications. These are the lessons the US Army learned from the Iraq War. American leaders and planners operated under the assumption that the war would be brief. There was a belief among American leaders that the conflict would last no more than 18 to 24 months. This assumption influenced all planning related to the war. The assumption that the war would be short-term led to long-term negative consequences within the US military. During the war, the military command in Iraq had very few troops available to carry out its military duties. Within this policy framework, Department of Defense leaders and strategic-level commanders created an actual limitation on US military forces in Iraq and prevented lower-level commanders from requesting more troops. The Department of Defense and military leaders acted under the belief that the US Army was too large, outdated, and cumbersome, and that sending more troops to Iraq would hinder the creation of more agile forces to face future threats. As a result of the troop limitations, commanders in Iraq, including during the expansion phase, constantly faced shortages in the troop-to-task ratio throughout the war. This led to inadequacies in dealing with both Sunni insurgencies, including Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Iran-supported Shia militias. Ultimately, the effort to stabilize Iraq took much longer than necessary and was politically unacceptable. Additionally, the insufficiency of US forces at the end of 2003 and the beginning of 2004 allowed Sunni and Shia insurgents to gain strength. Later, the withdrawal of US forces led to the ineffectiveness of the inadequately capable and increasingly politicized Iraqi security forces, reducing US influence over their behavior, effectiveness, and development. After the April-May 2003 invasion operation conducted under US Central Command, the war was managed and executed by temporary organizations' commands. Defense Department leaders, believing that the war would be short-lived and that creating large permanent new commands would be costly and unnecessary, chose to use temporary commands. This decision led to US forces in Iraq being organized into temporary commands that were not well trained, inconsistent, and faced issues due to constant rotation. While tactical units avoided the dangers of the Vietnam War's year-long individual rotation program, the command headquarters responsible for planning and managing the conflict fell short. Throughout the war, the Department of Defense and field planners assumed that the security situation in Iraq would improve over time and that the war would require fewer US troops in the future. Except for late 2006 and early 2007, strategic thinking did not reflect the idea that the security situation could worsen and require more US troops. US military plans were generally aligned with the assumption that General John P. Abizaid and General George W. Casey's new Iraqi government would be recognized as legitimate and reduce militant resistance. However, it proved to be the opposite. The US failed to fully understand the internal structure of the Ba'ath regime and the Iraqi security sector, placing too much emphasis on official government structures. Intelligence reports underestimated the impact of international sanctions on Iraq's infrastructure and society over the years. US soldiers also struggled to understand the enemy's strategic and operational intentions throughout the war. Due to the lack of understanding of the country's internal structure and relationships among groups, US forces sometimes inadvertently exacerbated hostilities by aligning with different groups. Ultimately, the US realized too late that differences and loyalties among local groups had significant implications for the state structure. During the Iraq War, US operational commanders struggled to determine whether their plans were successful or unsuccessful, especially as conditions on the ground changed. US commanders and staff could not agree on what metrics to use to measure the effectiveness of their forces. Throughout the war, both military and civilian entities tended to evaluate activities based on the activities themselves or inputs rather than outcomes. Examples include money spent, trained Iraqis, and the number of insurgents killed or captured. By 2006, the coalition viewed the 3 elections held in Iraq, the formation of the Iraqi security forces, and the successful withdrawal of coalition forces as key measures of success. Determining the legal status of individuals captured in the operational theater was one of the major issues. Whether to label them as detainees, as in other crimes, or as enemy combatants, as per wartime conditions, was a problem unresolved by U.S. officials. After the local Iraqi government took office, it was impossible to classify them as war criminals, and their fate was often left to the Iraqi security forces and judicial institutions. However, due to the weakness and corruption of these institutions, as well as their underdeveloped databases and physical conditions, the issue of detainees was not managed effectively. Many were either released or escaped due to inadequate security measures. Some of the leaders of al-Qaeda in Iraq and later ISIS were individuals previously detained by the U.S., including ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The easy return of these individuals, captured during operations, decreased the motivation of security forces and diminished their credibility among the public. There were even conspiracy theories suggesting that the U.S. had released these detainees to fuel sectarian conflicts. Iraq highlighted the need for a better doctrine for U.S. strategic operations planning. The U.S. and coalition allies invaded Iraq without detailed civil-military plans needed to stabilize the country after regime change. Over time, Operational Command and the U.S. Embassy developed progressive plans to achieve coalition goals in Iraq. But these were implemented in a trial-and-error manner. General David H. Petraeus and Ambassador Ryan C. Crocker, followed by Odierno and Austin, introduced multinational and interagency planning in the Joint Strategic Assessment Team and Joint Operations Plan. But this did not reflect U.S. doctrine. The threat environment faced after the war surpassed both the quantity and quality of those encountered during the conflict. Following the withdrawal of uniformed U.S. troops in the 1990s, private military companies became more prominent in service and support roles. This trend accelerated during the Iraq War, as senior military and civilian leaders reduced force level. Consequently, private military companies undertook military support tasks that U.S. troops were inadequate to perform, such as some logistical functions, parts of the Iraqi security forces training, and even the protection of large coalition bases. At times, there were more private military company personnel in the operational area than uniformed coalition troops. However, private military companies also brought their own challenges. Before the expansion phase, operational units lacked reliable systems to track the activities and locations of private military companies, sometimes leading to disruptions in military operations or dangerous situations without command knowledge. Additionally, the Iraqi public often could not distinguish between coalition military actions and those of Western private military companies, leading to the perception that the coalition was responsible for the negative actions of private military companies. A notable incident was the killing of 17 Iraqis by Blackwater personnel in Nasur Square, Baghdad, in September 2007, which had strategic repercussions. The operation to remove Saddam Hussein's regime unexpectedly and rapidly resulted in the collapse of the Iraqi government. This power vacuum was exploited by armed groups, which intensified the conflict whose effects are still felt today. One lesson from the invasion of Iraq is the need to be prepared for the fact that even limited operations in countries with central and authoritarian governments can lead to the complete disruption or even collapse of state systems. The governance vacuum left in Iraq remains unfilled to this day. Technology can support field units and military capabilities, but it cannot always compensate for reduced troop numbers. Counterinsurgency and stability operations in Iraq were generally conducted with a high-density presence. Additionally, irregular warfare inherently involves a military-political effort. Thus, engaging with the Iraqi people and understanding their socio-cultural structures was crucial. This task required more human interaction than technology could provide. Consequently, the reduction in the actual capacity of U.S. forces and the downsizing of transformed brigade combat teams led to insufficient ground power in counterinsurgency and stability operations. The Iraq War also challenged the assumption that the U.S. could conduct two major regional conflicts simultaneously. Before 2003, U.S. military leaders believed that the U.S. could execute operations in one regional conflict while maintaining stability in another. The Iraq War demonstrated that this was not the case. For example, decisive battles like Desert Storm left insufficient ground forces in other regions. Simultaneously managing major operations in Afghanistan and Iraq strained U.S. military resources, leading to personnel and unit deficiencies. The diplomatic and political value of the multinational coalition in the Iraq War was significant. However, these coalitions did not always provide the same level of operational benefit. One fundamental reason was the lack of a common strategic goal among coalition member states. Another reason was the reluctance of these countries to commit fully to operations. Furthermore, public opinion in these countries also affected the level of support for the operations. An occupying force must be prepared for extensive assistance to local security forces. This involves not only special units but also the effective use of traditional forces. The military must rapidly develop doctrines for how to conduct such assistance operations. In Iraq, this effort was significantly delayed, and it was only after 6 years that advisory and assistance brigades were established. Building capable and independent security forces requires interagency efforts over potentially decades. The prevailing U.S. mindset of getting Iraq to govern itself and leaving led to unrealistic expectations and rushed efforts. This process is inherently slow, painful, and requires detailed planning and the involvement of local politicians. Since the early 20th century, the U.S. has assumed that democratization leads to greater stability. However, as the post-9/11 wars have shown, elections do not always bring stability. U.S. decision-makers had high expectations from the 2005 elections in Iraq, believing they would enable the population to govern themselves and address security issues. Contrary to expectations, elections and the constitutional referendum led to increased polarization and heightened security issues rather than stability. Iraq transitioned to an approved constitution within about 30 months after the removal of the Ba'ath regime, while democratic processes in the U.S. itself took 12 years. This haste in pushing for elections without absorbing democratic requirements allowed Maliki's government to entrench its ethnic, religious, familial loyalties into governance structures. Those who took power in this manner felt more secure with U.S. support and eventually resisted reforms or reconciliation programs. The U.S. leaders' misconceptions about democratization and sovereignty were directly linked to another significant strategic error, equating the end of active conflict with the end of conflict itself. In reality, conflict continues even after active fighting ceases. Misinterpretations of violent statistics led U.S. leaders to view Iraq as more stable than it was. Moreover, effective operations required not only military efforts, but also economic and diplomatic activities. One of the most significant factors affecting counterinsurgency and counterterrorism efforts is the ability of armed groups to find safe havens in other countries, particularly neighboring ones. To succeed in these efforts, the U.S. must first address the actions of supporting countries. In Iraq's case, support came from Syria and Iran. Both sought to gain regional leadership advantages and obstruct U.S. efforts to effect regime change in their own countries, as well as to oppose the establishment of a new Iraqi government under U.S. administration. They provided sanctuary and strategic support to Sunni and Shia insurgencies, contributing to the deaths and injuries of thousands of Iraqis and coalition personnel. U.S. military and civilian leaders recognized this issue early in the conflict but failed to develop an effective strategy to address it. U.S. leaders in the Iraq War seemed to believe that regional nations would not react. When confronted with resistance, they opted for operational or tactical responses instead of strategic actions. Any operation in a region will elicit reactions from all neighboring states, even allies, as interests and goals may not always align. After hostilities began, understanding the motivations and potential actions of regional players was crucial for developing an interagency response. The inability of the U.S. to effectively counter Syrian and Iranian proxies made it nearly impossible to achieve political and military objectives in Iraq. The reports are actually extensive and detailed, and this was just a brief summary. As I wrap up the video, I want to share one final quote. One report stated, "In some ways, the mistakes made by the U.S. in the Iraq War could be seen as the result of poor decisions by less capable leaders. If better and smarter leaders had been chosen, it might have been possible to avoid similar mistakes in the future. However, this was not the case. Many decisions in the Iraq War were made by highly experienced leaders who often debated and reached consensus, making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but still failed to achieve strategic objectives. Therefore, simply selecting better leaders would not have been a sufficient solution to prevent the failures of the war. In the modern world, any war where the local population and the dominant powers in the country do not cooperate is doomed to end in chaos.